Okay, so imagine this. You've got this tool, right? And you can tell it to write you a poem or code or even like a whole symphony. And it just does it. That's generative AI. Crazy, right?
Yeah.
But it's definitely shaking things up.
Yeah, it's huge. Way bigger than just the tech trend, like when ChatGPT blew up and got 100 million users faster than anything else ever, even TikTok. That was a sign. We're talking a total shift in how we create, how we consume information.
Hmm.
And with that much power, we need to be excited, but also kind of cautious.
For sure. And for this deep dive, we're really diving deep. We've got this white paper from Data for Good, this group of French data scientists. They're all about using tech, especially AI, for good. And their paper really digs into the nitty-gritty of generative AI. What does it mean for us, for artists, for everyone, really?
I like Data for Good's whole approach. They're not just like, ooh, shiny AI. They're asking the tough questions, like, can we even trust the information it's giving us?
Because let's face it, sometimes even humans get things wrong. So how can we be sure this AI isn't feeding us a bunch of misinformation?
It's the big question, right? Data for Good makes this comparison to how we used to think about the universe. Like, remember when everyone thought the Earth was the center of everything? Those early astronomers weren't lying. They just didn't have all the information. And it's the same thing with AI. If it's trained on old data, it might be super sure about facts that are actually totally out of date.
So do we have to fact check every single thing it tells us? Like every poem, every song?
It's more about being a critical consumer of information, just like with anything else. You always have to think about the source and its limitations. Data for Good found that even the time frame of the AI's training data really matters. They found this one version of ChatGPT from March 2023 that seemed to remember stuff from February 2022, even though its training data supposedly only went up to September 2021.
That's kind of creepy. Like, is it tapping into some other dimension or something?
It really shows you the limitations of a system that's trained on a fixed set of information. As AI gets more advanced, we need to make sure it's always learning and updating. Can't get stuck in the past.
Right. It's like we need to make sure it has the latest edition of the encyclopedia.
Exactly. And speaking of things AI is shaking up, let's talk about the art world.
Oh, yeah. Remember that whole controversy? An AI-generated artwork won an art competition, and people were freaking out saying it wasn't real art.
Data for Good gets into that whole debate. They talk about Jason Allen, this artist who used an AI program called Midjourney to create a piece that won a prize. But here's the thing. It wasn't just a simple click and submit. This guy spent 80 hours fine-tuning those prompts, going through hundreds of images to get it right. And then there's this German photographer who won an award but then refused to accept it because he admitted his photo was AI generated. He wanted to start a conversation about AI's place in the art world, which is what Data for Good is doing too.
So is it more like the AI is just a really advanced tool, like a digital paintbrush? Where does the human artistry come in?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
Data for Good argues that it's all about prompt engineering, basically the art of writing those instructions for the AI. It's become a skill in itself. And get this, the U.S. Copyright Office is actually struggling with this right now. They're refusing to copyright AI-generated images because they say it's all too random. It's a legal minefield, and artists are right there on the front lines.
Wow. Talk about a can of worms, especially as AI gets even more advanced. What happens when AI can make a whole Beyonce album in, like, a day? Data for Good even talked about Grimes, the musician. She's totally cool with the idea. She said she'd split royalties 50-50 with anyone who uses AI to copy her style. The music industry must be freaking out.
It goes beyond the legal stuff, too. It brings up all these ethical questions. What about the artists whose styles are being used? Do they have any say in how their creative work is being used? Data for Good is really pushing for clear guidelines, some kind of legal framework to navigate all of this, because it's uncharted territory.
Yeah, it's like we need a whole new rule book for this AI stuff. And it's not just about copyright, right? What about bias? We all have biases, but AI seems to take them and like put them on blast, which could get really messy really fast. Like if you ask an AI to show you a picture of a CEO, what are you going to get? Some middle-aged white guy in a suit, right?
It's true. It's a big problem. Data for Good calls it algorithmic bias.
Huh.
And what they're finding is kind of scary. Even if you train an AI on data that seems totally neutral, it's still going to reflect the biases that already exist in society, even amplify them. They did this research on AI image generators, and it's crazy how homogenous the results were. Like, ask for a politician, and you get a bunch of pictures of men. A secretary, all women.
So even if the AI isn't trying to be biased, it's learning from a world that is, which is kind of depressing.
And Data for Good makes this really important point. It's not just about representation. It's about these harmful stereotypes getting reinforced. Like, they asked ChatGPT to name some French resistance heroes from World War II, and guess what? All men. It took some serious prompting to get it to even acknowledge that there were women in the resistance.
It's like the AI is telling us what it thinks we want to hear, just reinforcing our biases instead of challenging them.
Exactly. And it goes beyond gender, too. They talk about ageism, how older people are already more vulnerable to scams, and how something like AI-generated voice cloning could make things even worse. Think about it. You get a call from what sounds exactly like your grandchild, but it's actually an AI that's trying to steal your money. It's scary stuff.
Seriously scary. We're creating these incredibly powerful tools, but we have to be so careful about the downsides, right? And speaking of downsides, we can't forget about the environmental impact of all this AI. All that processing power, it can't be free, can it?
You're right, there's a cost. And Data for Good tackles this head on. They found that training just one of these big language models like GPT-3, it can produce as much CO2 as hundreds of flights. And that's just the training. Then you've got the energy consumption of the data centers, the environmental impact of the hardware itself, even the carbon footprint of every single user query. It all adds up.
So the more we use AI, the bigger its footprint gets.
Exactly. And these models are only getting bigger and more complex. I mean, have you heard about GPT-4? Rumor has it it's going to be 10 times bigger than GPT-3. Data for Good calls this the rebound effect. We make technology more efficient, more people use it, and it can actually cancel out any progress we've made. Like, imagine if every company out there started using AI-powered marketing, creating personalized ads for every single person on the planet. Can you imagine the environmental cost of that?
It's a tough one. We're talking about tools that could help solve some of the world's biggest problems, but we have to balance that with the resources they use. So what can we do? It's easy to get overwhelmed by all this, right?
Well, Data for Good gives us some hope. They actually offer a bunch of recommendations for everyone, for regular users like us, for developers, even for policymakers. They want us to really think about whether we actually need AI for a task, to demand more transparency from the companies building this technology, and to push for AI development that prioritizes sustainability from day one.
It's about being more mindful, right? Being aware of the impact of our actions and trying to steer this technology in the right direction.
Exactly. Data for Good reminds us that we're not just passive bystanders here. We have a say in how AI is developed and used. It's not about being afraid of AI. It's about being thoughtful and intentional about how we interact with it.
That makes sense. But what does that look like in our everyday lives? What are some concrete things listeners can do to be more responsible AI users? So where do we even start? It feels like this AI train has already left the station.
Well, Data for Good has some really practical advice. First off, be picky. Be really critical of AI-generated content, especially art. Don't just assume something is legit, Ask questions. Was AI involved? What program did they use? How was it trained? Are there any weird licensing things going on?
It's like checking the label on your food, right? You want to know what's in it, where it came from.
Exactly. And artists, you've got to be proactive about protecting your work. Do your research. Is your stuff floating around online without your permission? Know your rights. They even suggest experimenting with different AI art generators, using your own name as a style prompt. See what happens,
That's kind of scary, actually. The idea that someone could just use my name and create art in my style without asking. It's like, what does authorship even mean anymore?
It's a huge question. And it's exactly why artists need to be informed and empowered. Data for Good also talks about watching out for bias, even in those little everyday AI interactions.
Like, how do we even spot that?
Well, they specifically mentioned being careful with chatbots, the ones that companies and government agencies use. Don't just blindly trust the information they give you. Really look at it. And if you suspect bias, report it.
It's like being a digital detective, right?
Yeah.
Sniffing out those little clues that point to a bigger problem.
Exactly. The more we point these instances of bias out, the better equipped we are to actually fix the root causes, to really push for fairer AI.
And Data for Good reminds us that all this AI creativity, it doesn't come cheap. And I'm not just talking about money. There's an environmental cost, too.
Yeah, they really drive home the point that we can't just use AI without thinking about the consequences. Like, if there's a less energy-intensive way to do something, do that instead. And think about the ripple effects.
Right. It's easy to forget that every little click, every Google search, it all adds up.
Data for Good's message is clear. Use AI with intention. Don't just hop on the bandwagon because it's cool and new. Make sure it's actually useful. Does it have a real purpose?
This whole conversation reminds me of that saying, With great power. What is it?
With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, it's the one. And we've got this incredibly powerful technology now. We can't just use it without thinking.
They don't let anyone off the hook either. Data for Good has a whole section of recommendations for the people actually building these systems, the data scientists, the developers.
Okay, so what's their advice for the folks behind the scenes?
They really emphasize ethics. Like, baking ethics into the entire development process. Transparency is huge, especially when it comes to things like environmental impact. Imagine if every AI product came with, like, a breakdown of its carbon footprint.
It'd be like a nutrition label, but for tech.
Exactly. They even suggest that data scientists should be ready to walk away from projects that could be used for bad stuff, even if it means they lose money or recognition.
Wow, that's a powerful message. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Right. It shows a real commitment to ethical AI.
Uh-huh.
They also talk about needing better tools to identify and fix bias in AI. And it's not just about avoiding biased data. It's about understanding the context. How is this AI going to be used in the real world?
It's like you could design the fairest AI system ever, but if it's used in a system that's biased, well, the problem's not going to go away.
Exactly. Data for Good wants data scientists to be proactive, to be on the lookout for potential biases at every stage of the process.
So it's not a one and done kind of thing.
Not at all. It's ongoing.
Yeah.
And they don't just stop there. Data for Good calls for government action too. We need regulations to ensure responsible AI development across the board.
Like what? What are they suggesting?
They talk about stricter rules, especially when it comes to auditing AI systems,
Yeah.
checking for bias, looking at environmental impact.
Yeah.
They're also big fans of open source development, which makes sense. More transparency, more collaboration.
More eyes on the code, more voices in the conversation.
Exactly. They even think policymakers should think about offering incentives for companies who prioritize sustainability and ethical AI. Reward the good guys.
Right.
Maybe others will follow.
It sounds like Data for Good is really pushing for a collaborative effort. It's not just on individuals or companies or governments. Everyone has to work together to create a system where ethical AI development is the norm, not the exception.
100%. And you know what else they highlight? Education. We need to be talking about this. They want to see public awareness campaigns to help people understand just how complex AI is and how big its impact could be.
Because ultimately, we're all stakeholders in this, right? We've all got a role to play in shaping the future of AI.
That's what Data for Good's work really highlights.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and watch this technology happen. We have to engage with it, be informed, and use our voices to try to steer things in the right direction. Make sure AI serves humanity, not the other way around.
This deep dive into Data for Good's white paper has been pretty amazing. Generative AI has so much potential for good, but there are also some real risks. It's up to all of us to figure out how to make the right choices and steer this technology in a positive direction. If we don't, well, who knows what the future holds.